or it's a proto, awareness, or it's a proto intentionality. All of those terms might be loosely in the ballpark, but in some ways they seem to be a little too complex for something like a quark to have. So, but I do fully agree that a quark has an interior and it does have prehension. And so we do get this notion that there really is a fundamental distinction between interior realities and exterior realities. If we keep looking at those kinds of distinctions, probably the second most common distinction is between singular and plural. Mm-hmm. And this also is something that shows up right from the beginning, and it turns out to be extremely important. So if you put these two major distinctions together, interior and exterior, or subjective and objective, or the view from within and the view from without, and you put that together with individual holons versus their collective holons, or individuals versus groups, or individuals versus systems, and so on. That's an extremely common distinction we make. And essentially, no existing holon can exist simply on its own indefinitely. We really do even if you look at something like when the first frogs emerged in evolution, one thing we know for sure is that it wouldn't work if only one frog emerged, even though the frog was completely capable of living and eating and drinking and surviving. The problem is, it's not going to exist beyond itself unless it sexually reproduces. And that means there has to be at least a male and a female. And that means when we say, oh, the first frog emerged, that's not what we mean. We mean, no, the first community of frogs emerged. There had to be at least two of them. Mm-hmm. And for it to actually work, there had to be several of each. They had to actually find each other. And then little wine, little dinner, little romance, and then sex, and then they get to reproduce. So even evolutionary unfolding, we just never really see just an individual emerge. We see all four quadrants emerge. That's the unit that evolves. So we have these interior and exterior, and we have individual and collective. And that gives us these four really fundamental dimensions. This is not to say there aren't other dimensions. There are. It's just these are some of the absolutely fundamental ones. And so that's what we mean by the quadrants. Mm-hmm. Now, technically, prehension occurs in all four quadrants. But it especially shows up and refers to, and we focus on this quadrant when we say prehension. We mean the upper left quadrant. We mean an individual awareness or proto-feeling or prehension. And so that's why we put prehension as the fundamental holon in the upper left quadrant. And so one of the things that we want to do is look at how that prehension emerges, because this does play straight into free will and determinism. So one of the ways that I particularly like is Whitehead's view of how this moment-to-moment experience occurs. I don't agree with all of it, because I do expand it to four quadrants. Whereas Whitehead was typically moving in just a monological stream of subject, object, subject, object, subject, object. But the essentials that he outlined are really crucial. So in any given moment, a subject comes into existence. It just emerges out of wherever it emerges, wherever this moment emerges from, some vast emptiness, some creative plenum. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about the spiritual dimension. But it emerges, and so for Whitehead, it emerges as a subject of experience. So we would say this is an atom of experience. And as that subject emerges, it will prehend the previous subject. Now, prehend, which essentially I use as just the rudimentary forms of experience or awareness. Technically, the word means to touch or to embrace or even to grasp. And so for Whitehead, what's happening is the present subject emerges, it prehends the previous subject because it's lying right there. So it emerges, touches it, and that's how the past is passed on to the present. So this subject that came up and represented the present moment, as soon as the next present moment arises and there's a new subject, then it will prehend the previous subject, making it an object. So in each case, the subject of one moment of experience becomes the object of the subject of the next moment of experience. And that tends to be a very, very built-in pattern. It's one of the few ways a universe that has this form can actually fit with an entirely different universe that arises in the next moment. They have to fit together some way. And Whitehead was addressing that issue. So as the new subject prehends the previous subject, making it an object, and again, to finish that thought, you see this all the way up into human development itself. That's still continuing. Right. So as I were Keegan to say, the subject of one stage of development becomes the object of the subject of the next stage of development. That's just a macro expansion of the microscopic moment-to-moment subject becoming object of the next subject.
Yep.
So that's one of the fundamental habits, if you will, of evolution. It's very, very central and crucial. Now, if that's all that happened, because when that subject actually touches, prehends, or embraces the previous moment, then clearly it's affected by that previous moment. It has some sort of causal impact on the previous moment. So the past has some sort of deterministic effect on the present. And that's real. So when we say each moment transcends and includes the previous moment, this is the include part.
Right.
This is the causality part, if you will, karma.
Yep.
So when the previous moment embraces the moment before it, then it's embracing a karmic unfolding. But this is Whitehead's really astonishing addition to that unfolding. And that is after the present subject, the present moment, has prehended the past, then it also adds its own little bit of creativity, its own little bit of novelty. And that's what's so central. And Whitehead arrived at this not by looking at the second law of thermodynamics, because that ends up to be an extremely limited version of what the universe will do under certain circumstances. The universe also does many different things than that. If you just focus on the second law of thermodynamics, the entire universe is just running down.
Right.
It should be getting just more and more dispersed, more simple, rudimentary broken into its fragmentary parts. And we don't really see that happening, except in certain areas where there actually is a dissolution of some existing structure and it just kind of falls apart. But for Whitehead, he had what he called three ultimates. These are three things that you had to have before you could even get a universe up and running. And the first one was just the one. Mm-hmm. The next one was the many. And then the third one was what was so interesting, the creative advance into novelty. And that's such a brilliant thing to say, okay, this is inherent in the universe. Because if you actually sort of stand back and look at the direction of the overall universe and see, okay, which direction is that actually going? It's not winding down, it's winding up.
Right.
You get more and more complex entities. You get more and more self-organized entities. They have a greater degree of wholeness and unity. They have greater self-organization, and it appears greater consciousness. So that's unmistakable. You can't miss that. Right. And so Whitehead simply said, right, that's the fundamental factor. And he's not getting that from the second law of thermodynamics. He's getting it from an absolutely obvious look at how evolution actually operates. Mm-hmm. So now you have basically in each moment-to-moment unfolding, there is a component both that transcends the previous moment and includes it. And so that inclusion part is causality or determinism or karma. And the transcend part is the newness, the novelty, the creativity. And so we really do have novelty versus causality. We have creativity versus karma, and we have free choice versus determinism. Mm-hmm. And both of those are occurring. So never is it either or.
Right.
And as soon as it becomes just one or just the other, evolution breaks down right on the spot.
Right. It's Calvin and it's Hobbes.
That, in a certain sense, yeah. Another one of the items that we want to talk about, in addition to interiors, 4 quadrants, prehension, creativity, but it's just the notion of novelty itself.
Right.
Because that also can be confusing and used in several different ways. Novelty really means unprecedented. It means something is coming into being that really is new. And that means we've never seen it before. It's never existed before. And if it has existed in some way before, that's not novelty. That's not a real newness. Mm-hmm. So novelty, to say novelty is to say that's a big issue. And any sort of true creativity has to have, at least as a component, some sort of novelty, or it's not creative. So novelty in the cosmos is tied to free will. So some compatibilists point out correctly that even if everything is causally determined, that doesn't prevent what we mean, what the average person means when they say free will. So I can say, for example, okay, right now I'm going to move my arm on my own free will. There, did it. So either that action was determined by things that were present right at the Big Bang. And so moving my arm is the result of what happened at the Big Bang.
Yep.
Over 14 billion years, as said, Ken will move his arm at this particular time in history. Or it didn't come from the Big Bang. And pretty clearly it didn't. So the point, though, is that even if moving my arm had a deterministic substrate, even if there were factors that were causing it and determining it and all of that, it's still not going to affect my free will. Because even if all of my actions are determined and I say I'm going to move my arm. I don't care if they're determined or not. I still am choosing to move my arm, and I'm doing it. So deterministic doesn't apply to that kind of freedom. They're very different things. And of course, again, our whole legal system is based on whether I'm responsible for the actions that I make.
That's right.
And if I do something and can demonstrate that I was forced to do it, or I might even have schizophrenia and am legally insane, under those circumstances, I'm not held responsible, even though I'm doing it.
Right.
So our whole legal system, actually our entire societal interactions, are built on the fact that people have choices.
That's right.
And determinism's not going to stop that. So if we say, like Harris will tend to say, for example, oh, well, all of these brain factors that we don't know about are determining what we think. Well, if we say, okay, I want to grow and develop so I can increase my degrees of freedom, which is what development does.
Yep.
If Harris is right, what I would have to be saying was, I want to grow and increase my degrees of freedom by reducing the control the brain has over my behavior. Well, I'm not trying to change brain physiology as I try to become more free. I don't give a shit about what brain physiology is doing. I can still increase my degrees of freedom. And we see this in development all the time.
Yep.
It goes from first person to second person to third person to fourth person. Each of those are an increase in freedom, even with the same brain physiology. Again, these are different quadrants with different meanings of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter what's going on in the upper right quadrant in terms of freedom in the upper left. These are two entirely different perspectives. So they all have to be taken into account, but you can't use one, the non-exclusion principle. You can't use one paradigm to deny the other. And that's what they're trying to do. And that categorically is not right. So let me see. Right. And when I say we can still work towards freedom, individual freedom, and later we'll see political freedom, later we'll see cultural freedom. Whenever we're working on any of those freedoms, we're not trying to change brain physiology and make it more free. I don't even know what making brain physiology more free would mean. So that's
shooting yourself in the head.
That's not what's being discussed here. So all those arguments that say, oh, we have brain physiology, they're irrelevant. They're not, they're crossing quadrants. They're confusing validity claims. They're confusing different types of truths. It's a disaster.
Yep.
But I reject determinism, not just because of that, because I'm even allowing that there might be determinism in the upper right quadrant. But we can't even do that fully, again, because of the Heisenberg indeterminacy principle. So You can't even say the upper right has a hard determinism. It doesn't. It's indeterministic at its core. And one of the main reasons that we reject hard determinism is, again, the simple fact of this undeniable creative advance into novelty that categorically occurs. And whether you want to say, well, it's all deterministic or it's all radically free, you can't deny the creative novelty that's emerging and coming into existence at almost every stage of evolution. And that's simply an undeniable reality. And so that's why that's one of the major reasons we reject a hard determinism. Again, it's our actions right now are not determined strictly by everything that happened yesterday. So I mentioned that there are, if we just sort of look at the four quadrants and look at the different types of freedom in those four quadrants, and then see how that fits in with the free will versus determinism, because they really are quite different. They really are referring to different things. So I'll give you the sort of three common meanings of freedom first, and then I'll point out how each of those applies to a different quadrant. Now, these different meanings of freedom are ones that you can find in the free will debate. They just aren't often differentiated. And so somebody will just pick one version, argue that, and think that it's taking care of the others, and it's not. So the first is a meaning of freedom is not caused, not determined. And that's what the libertarian means. And when freedom's defined that way, then the argument is between free will versus determinism. And that does tend to be an extreme version of both sides of those that really don't prove anything, but they're often the ones that are argued because it's easy to make a case for their quadrant absolutism. The second is freedom as free agency. So here, if I decide to do something and it's of my own free will, then, and I do it, then I'm free. I have freedom. And that's because it's coming from my own inner decisions. I'm making this decision to do this. And so that's considered to be free for the people that use freedom in that sense. Several well-known philosophers have used freedom in that sense. So David Hume does, Immanuel Kant does. For Kant, something's free, not if it's heteronomous or caused by somebody else. If my actions are caused by somebody else, I'm not free. But if I have autonomy, which is a developmental higher stage, then I'm imposing constraints on myself. I'm doing that, so I'm free. And that's one major meaning. And that doesn't have anything to do with determinism. Again, it can all be determined or not. It doesn't change this anyway. And then the last one is an absence of unwelcome restrictions. And that can mean exterior restrictions or interior restrictions. So, number one, the causal determinism. It's freedom versus causal determinism. That's something we see in the upper right. So that's a classic physical definition of cause and effect. And you do this and it automatically causes that. It can't be otherwise. That's the one that, in any sort of absolutistic way, that's the one that's been shot down by the quantum indeterminacy. That's just false as a assertion. But the upper right is the one that's going to have a lot of determinism. So to say that there's quantum indeterminacy doesn't mean that there aren't still causal factors operating. It means not all of them are deterministic. So you do find a lot of deterministic factors operating in the other upper right. You can still use Newtonian physics to get a person to the moon. So that's, you know, it's not debilitating, except as a philosophical argument, you simply can no longer say that the universe is hard deterministic. That won't work. But that kind of causal, that meaning of freedom, that applies only to the upper right. Then you have free agency. If what I'm decide to do is the product of my own free will, then I'm free. And that is classically upper left. That's where your free agency is, free individual choice. And that's what that means. If your agency is free, if it's coming from your own will, then we say we have freedom. And clearly there are examples where that does happen. Now, all of these, of course, exist in a whole sea of restraints. And we'll talk about that. And then finally, the absence of unwelcome restrictions. This is especially the lower quadrants. Mm-hmm. And so exterior restrictions are the lower right, and interior restrictions are the lower left. So an example of a restriction in the lower right might be being thrown in jail or put in slavery or something like that. And then example of restriction in the lower left culture would be just stereotypes about being gay or other unfair restrictions on what you can be according to the culture.
Shame and yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we have these very different freedoms, and we can see that each of them are operating in one of the different quadrants. And so in the lower quadrants with lower left and lower right, the freedom from unwelcome restrictions, this often goes into political freedom because that's where these things are determined. So if you don't want to be in the Gulag archipelago, which would be a fair amount of unfreedom, then you have to change the political environment that caused that. When the Declaration of Independence says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that liberty is what they mean, a political freedom. And that's what they wanted. That's clearly different from freedom in brain physiology or in the upper right or anything so like that. So when we seek political freedom, again, if Sam Harris was right, that would mean we're trying to reduce the control that our brain physiology has over our behavior. Because that's how he'll say, well, we're not free because we can't choose our thoughts, and our thoughts that just happen. And that's not what you're trying to do with political freedom. You're not trying to make your brain more free. You're working with political systems and making them more free. Mm-hmm. So it has nothing to do with changing basic brain physiology in the upper right. It's seeking political freedom in the lower right, and then cultural freedom from things like stereotypes in the lower left. These are different freedoms entirely, and these types of arguments of just free will versus determinism, period, that's not helping these issues very well. It's not giving hardly any sort of clarity on what's actually happening. So overall, I know you have some questions about constraints, and we can move into that. But I would just maybe summarize some of what we've said. And this is based on a way that you had worded it in one of your questions. But free will in an individual is the intersection of an interiority with its prehension and a creativity, at the very least, meaning an indeterministic center of some sort of novelty. And then that's being filtered through an evolutionary emergent of self-reflexivity. So those first two items, the core of prehension and the core of indeterminate action, those go all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
As evolution continues to grow and develop, and we start to become aware of those, then that's what we call free will.
Right.
And so that does tend to emerge. But again, those core ingredients, creative advance into novelty, prehension, those go all the way down, all the way up. So that's kind of a background overview of this whole notion of free will and determinism. And then as we get into future areas, it'll become more interesting, because then it's things like, okay, well, where does that freedom come from? Or what is that creativity? How is that present? And all of these things. And we can talk about that. But you did have some questions about how